Good morning. My name is Marcia Stevenson, and I'm the Vice President of your Board of Trustees. Welcome to the North Shore Unitarian Church, where our mission is to empower people to live with greater depth, meaning, and purpose. One of the things I love about this community is the way we can talk to each other about almost any topic under the sun, but also practice listening intentionally to each other and treasure our moments of shared silence. In this community, we celebrate people from all walks of life. Whether you are the life of the party, or bloom in quiet contemplation, or reject all categories altogether, no matter how you experience the sacred, no matter who you are or who you love, we hope you will feel welcome here. Good morning.
About books. We have an amazing resource downstairs in our library. So I'd invite people, if you haven't browsed it lately, take a look. It's lovingly curated. And there are also a number of brand new children's books. This is one of them that are looking for people to sponsor. And I believe Nicole is downstairs and she'll be there after the service and can talk to you more about what's involved there. And after the service, we also have a number of programs. There's UU 101 for anyone who's wanting to know more about our tradition in this congregation, which is a conversation right after the service. And then at 12:30 with Reverend Emily, there's Parenting as a Spiritual Practice in Chelsea House, just over there. And here in the sanctuary, a conversation about prayer with Reverend Marcus. So welcome again.
For about 5 years or so, I worked at the Children's Hospital in Montreal. It was wonderful to be part of a team of people who could help injured children get better. Few jobs in life as worth as that. I absolutely loved it. One little girl stands out as I think about those years. She was from Pond Inlet in the Arctic, and she came to us with injuries so that we could fix her, obviously. I knew when I saw how injured she was that because she lived so far away, she couldn't go back and forth to home. She would stay with us in the hospital in Montreal for many months. I was concerned about her, not only because of her injuries, but because she was so alone. She had no family nearby. We did not speak her language. She was only 5. Most of the time, she just lay quietly in her bed. I was very concerned. I didn't know how on earth we were going to reach her. She was going to be locked away unless we did something. So what I did was I just sat with her. I brought a chair to her bedside and I sat with her day after day after day. No demands, chatted a little bit, but really just was there, just trying to be a presence so that maybe we could develop a little trust between us. Once she was in a cast, then she could be a little more mobile. So we lifted her up, put her tummy side down on a footstool, which was up on casters, and she could pull herself around and go explore the ward. But she still remained very quiet and very aloof about the whole thing. One day when she was traveling around, she came across a piece of paper lying on the floor. It was covered with little tiny drawings of bunnies and pussycats and houses and tools and dogs and etc. I figured that probably a mom had drawn all these when she was in visiting her child and it got left behind and then fell down on the floor. I noticed that the little sweetie was spending a lot of time just looking at this. And, oh, that's better. Shall I start over? Anyway, I went over to her and watched her examining it closely, and she looked up at me. She pointed to the hammer, and then she did this. Whoa. I nodded, and pointed to the saw, and she did this. At last, finally, we were talking to one another, and she was reaching out. The reason for the story this morning is that we have the opportunity here at the church to reach out in that fashion. I'm sure all of you have had the experience of sitting close to someone, being quiet, just being there, and then making a connection. Well, that's what we can do with something called the Soul Matters groups. They just started this month, and the purpose of them is to allow us the opportunity to connect to life, to each other, and to ourselves.
I'd like to invite any children who would like to be a little closer, any adults as well, are always welcome to come forward for a story. So this is a picture of something, it's not a great focused picture actually, but it's a picture of something you may have seen in real life, in person before. Do any of you recognize this carving? Where? Yes. Where have you seen it? Do you remember? It's in a museum, yes. This is in the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia. Have you been there? Yeah. Maybe with a school trip, maybe with a family member. So this is a story that comes from the Haida people, further north in what we now know as British Columbia. And this carving was done by an artist, Bill Reed, and he had a Haida, he was part from English ancestry and part Haida ancestry. And this story is an origin story. It's about how did people begin? How did kind of the world as we know it today begin? And what do you see in this carving? What do you see? What is it? People. You see people? Yes. What else? Yeah. You see an eagle. Yes, it looks like an eagle. It's actually a raven. This is a giant raven. In Haida mythology, as I've been learning recently, the raven is kind of this large, creative, generative, somewhat mischievous creature, kind of a source of transformation and exploration. That's what the raven means in the Haida understanding. And so the raven was flying way, way high in the sky, and saw a very small shell, a clam shell, on the beach. And out of the clam shell were starting to crawl these very tiny people from inside the shell. And the raven swooped down to get a closer look, and this was pretty interesting. There were no people creatures yet in the world. And the raven thought, well, this is quite fascinating. Tiny creatures with no fur and no feathers coming out of this shell. I'd like to get to know them more. So the raven had a particular smooth-talking quality. This might be what you do when you get your parents to give you extra Halloween candy, or watch a little more television. You have this way of talking that says, yes, you really want to do this for me. So this is kind of what the raven did with the clamshell people. They were on their way out, but they were a little bit scared because they were quite small. To fit in a shell, you must have been very small, and you were encountering this enormous bird. Pretty scary. But that bird, that raven, coaxed them out of the clamshell and into the world. And that's how we have the first humans in the Haida origin story. Yeah. So thank you for listening, for sharing. And I give you that story to go and think about. What is the relationship between very small people and very large forces in the world? And how do they interact with each other? And what's that smooth talking all about? What does that get us?
Good morning, my name is Shirley McDonald. When I first started coming to North Shore Unitarian Church almost 15 years ago, I was looking for life's big questions. Is there a God? Mysteries of death and the hereafter, and more. I wasn't particularly looking for community, as many in my group were. After I became a regular, people would ask me where my husband was, as if we had to do everything together. And I would say, oh, he's at home watching football, or hockey, or baseball, and on and on. After a few years of being left behind, Ian started coming with me, probably out of curiosity more than anything else. That was when Stephen became our minister. Before long, Ian was hooked and quickly joined the board and was a willing participant in discussion groups, a men's group, and social occasions. Beside that big surprise, I also found that the church was full of other surprises too. There were so many group events and discussion groups, I couldn't fit them all in. Beside all that, the midnight events certainly filled our calendar, and we found that we were making friends and acquaintances with some pretty remarkable people. Last month, I learned about artificial intelligence one weekend while being served dinner, and at a midnight event, and the next weekend watched a Michael Moore film. And actually, the following weekend, I was at a circle dinner and having dinner with new friends. When my husband was diagnosed with terminal cancer, the loving support and encouragement came from all directions: ministers, staff, and friends in the congregation. We really felt blessed with the community that we'd become part of. Thank you all for your support and caring and encouragement during those difficult years. When Ian passed away, I had never planned a memorial service before, but with the guidance and assistance from Marcus and many others, too numerous to mention, we delivered a beautiful service. Many of our friends said that it was the most beautiful service that they'd ever attended. I know a lot of you were there too. I still haven't found the answers to life's big questions, but I'm slowly working on it. One thing I know for sure is that no matter what life throws at me, I'm in the right place with the best possible community for me. And I'm looking forward to more surprises.
Fully now, take a breath and a deeper breath. Let your feet find the floor, connecting you down to this good earth. And turn inward with me for this time that is for prayer or meditation, contemplation, stillness. Spirit of life, Spirit of love. The seasons are turning. The story of the world turns toward crisp and cold. The story of our community turns toward celebrations of family. On this bright day, may our stories, whatever is held in this sanctuary today, may those stories be told and heard so deeply that they are transformed and brought ever closer to love, to wholeness, to beauty. And may those twisted, roundabout places in our stories, those places of trauma or trouble, of challenge, of growth and resilience, especially those places in our stories May they be held in this great spirit of life, this great spirit of love that will not let us go.
When people ask me where I come from, I often hesitate. I could say New York, where we just moved from a year ago and my dad grew up. Or I could say in California, where I went to graduate school and lived for years before that, where much of my family still lives. But generally, I stick to the place I lived the longest in my life so far was where I grew up in Kentucky, in the South, in the States. Sometimes I say my parents still live in that same house where I grew up. And when people hear this, very often, especially if I'm in Canada or California or New York, people's eyes will get kind of wide. And they'll be like, wow. I've even heard I've never met someone from Kentucky before. Well, isn't today your lucky day? And of course, sometimes people will actually question this and say, but you don't have a Southern accent. It's true, and I say, I haven't lived there since I was 17. People sort of nod, mm-hmm. But if I'm feeling playful, I might say, oh, no, you don't think so? Well, I do turn it on when I need it. Sometimes I wonder if they are imagining a log cabin in the woods where my mother raised me on grits and cornbread while my dad chopped wood and milked the cows. That's pretty far from the truth of my homeland. I grew up with TV and a dial-up internet connection as soon as it was available. We did once have cows come up the driveway, but that was because someone left the gate open at the farm across the street. We didn't live on a farm, just next to one. My father was a psychologist, is a psychologist. He drives a sports car, pretty much as far from milking cows as you can get. My mother is an artist, not much of a cook. She makes block prints and folds origami. She don't think she's ever made grits. When people hear that I'm from the South, and I don't look like or have the accent that they may expect that fits into this larger narrative, it's a small example of what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a Nigerian writer, describes as the single story. For most of us, there is a single story about what we have learned about much of the world. Isn't all of Australia hot and dry and overrun with kangaroos? Aren't all French people just a little bit snobby? And don't all black people like to dance? All fill in the blank. Adichie, in her TED Talk from 2009, opens with this story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably closer to the truth. I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obliged to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, they ate apples, and they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now this, despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside of Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. Adichie says when she began to have access to and read Nigerian and African literature, she realized for the first time that her reality could also be the stuff of books and literature. Growing up, her single story was the literal stories of British and American children's literature. And later, when she came to North America for university, she experienced how dangerous having a single story can be. Because so many people have a single story about Africa. For example, Adiche's roommate in university asked her if she could listen to some of her tribal music. And Adiche noticed that she was very disappointed when she pulled out a Mariah Carey tape. She says, my roommate had this single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe where there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, and no possibility of connection as human equals. The stories we know, the ones we can tell by heart, they have a profound impact on our psyche and our worldview. We will write the stories like the ones we have been told. We will live lives like the stories we have heard, and we will tell others the stories that we were told. I find it fascinating that children so young to have never experienced much of the world can know vocabulary like alligator and dragon and castle, maybe having never seen any of those things. And isn't it true we all know what a dragon looks like, although I bet you've never seen one. But we all have a story that we are sharing about a dragon and what it looks like. What's the oldest story you know? The oldest story you know. For me, the oldest story that I can tell without having to look it up is that of Adam and Eve from the Hebrew and Christian scriptures in Genesis. Now, in this church, in our faith tradition, we don't take the Bible literally, but its stories and its meanings are flooded into our cultural systems, the way that we think and act, even millennia after these stories were first written down and told. In the story of Adam and Eve, I'm guessing many of you know it as well, could tell it without looking it up. God has placed humans in a beautiful garden and told them that the creation is theirs to take care of and will nourish them, and that there is one tree and one fruit that is not to be consumed, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, this part of the story I had to look up because I wanted to get it right according to the text. The dialogue from Genesis 3 between the serpent and Eve. Now the serpent was more crafty than any wild animal that God had made, and he said to the woman, "Did God say you shall not eat from the tree in the garden?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die." And the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die. For God knows that if you eat of it, and your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, she took of its fruit and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Now, of course, after this, everything gets quite dramatic. No one dies, but God gets PO'd. At Adam and Eve for disobeying, he punishes them and kicks them out of the garden. The oldest story I know about a woman being curious and getting in trouble. Like any good feminist, I've always been suspicious of this Adam and Eve story. I mean, come on. One piece of fruit, and then suddenly, through somehow, women are blamed for the downfall of humanity for the next several millennia and the origin of sin. This is an old, old story, and it is not just an origin story, but an origin of who we are. And tragically, for too long, it has been held up as part of the story of why women are inferior to men. Today, in the 21st century, here in North America, in the world that I often consider advanced in different ways, I recognize how much we are still struggling. We are still struggling and wrestling with men's power over women. This hit me hard a few weeks ago, following the #MeToo campaign, in which women publicly named the experience of assault and abuse in their lives. It started with actress Alyssa Milano in response to the news about the many sexual harassment allegations concerning Hollywood executive Harvey Weinstein. Did you all hear about this? It started with Milano on Twitter. She encouraged women who'd been sexually harassed or assaulted to tweet the words #MeToo. Within 24 hours, 500,000 women had shared the hashtag and their stories. And over the next week, thousands more responded. So yes, even now in our world we may like to think of as advanced, we are still deeply influenced by this old, old story that men have power over women. All I can say is, thank Goddess for feminist scholarship. There is another way to tell the story of Adam and Eve, and it is there in the text. That's why I went back and read it again this week. Feminist scholar and theologian Phyllis Tribble notices how in Genesis, the serpent addresses the woman. The man is not considered. The serpent engages the woman in a deep theological debate about the risk and value and purpose of the tree of knowledge. Eve, in Tribble's telling, is not simple-minded or gullible or was seduced in some way, but informed, intelligent, perceptive, even perhaps an ethicist, a leader who acted with some form of authority and clarity for herself. Eve eats the apple or the mango or whatever it is that fruit was. She engages directly with power, with risk, with the moral dimensions of life. Tribble notes how the man just did what the woman did. He didn't engage her in a debate. And with this lens, it is possible to see and hear a very different story. A story that instead of blaming women, recognizes their agency and choice and intelligence. How can we find new meaning in an old, old story? As a white settler in North America and a very, very new Canadian, I am aware that as I told the Haida story this morning, I do not have the full context, and I do not know all the dimensions of the Haida tradition. But I am aware as well of the danger of a single story. And I wanted to bring in another origin story to look at, other than the one that has been so formative to the Western Christian culture I come out of. In my reading about Haida mythology, I learned that the raven is often described as a trickster, but that Haida tradition says the raven is a complex reflection of one's own self, a creative and transformative being, simultaneously mischievous or greedy or even debaucherous, but at the same time, the raven, over and over again, helps humans in their encounters with other supernatural beings. And so in the raven and the clamshell story, it is clear that these humans are already on their way out when the raven notices them, and with his clever tongue, note the serpent also has a clever tongue, coaxes them out of the shell and into the world. So these clamshell people, they must have been so small and so vulnerable. And this must have been one really smooth-talking raven to get such tiny, vulnerable creatures out of their protective shell and into the world. Or perhaps it is not all due to the raven's fast-talking. They were already on their way out, these curious, tiny people, curious enough and brave enough to face the raven. Perhaps they would have found their way out of the shell even without the raven's coaxing. Origin stories, it seems, are often about risk. The risk to live. The risk to face the unknown, to eat of the apple, to take steps towards the knowledge of good and evil. And as I reflected alongside the story of the raven and the clamshell with the story of Adam and Eve, I see the relationship in both, between the powerful and the weak, the tension between choice and trickery, and what happens when we're curious. Curiosity in the raven and the clamshell people leads to new adventure, new experience, new life, and new relationship. And in the most traditional patriarchal telling of Adam and Eve, curiosity, well, it doesn't lead to good things. Sin, punishment, or abandonment by God. But with a feminist lens on Genesis, we discover an Eve who is savvy, who is bold and unapologetic, whose curiosity sparks the turning of the world. Is there a way to live without risk, without moving towards the unknown? Perhaps this is what origin stories are asking us at their heart. What will we do with our curiosity? Where will it lead us? There is not just one story that composes the world. There's not just one way a story can be told. To close, one last sort of origin story. Once upon a time, there was a man who loved to read the Sunday newspaper, cover to cover. But he rarely had the opportunity because he had a young daughter, and she was often asking for his attention. The father would do everything he could to kind of distract her and entertain her so he could have a moment of peace. A little more time to read the newspaper. And one day he's frustrated, he's exasperated, and he's had so little time for himself that he finds this page in the travel section. It's a map of the whole world. And he rips the page off and he tears it into little pieces. And he shows it to his daughter and he says, "This is a game for you. It's a puzzle. Come back to me when you have taped the whole world back together." And he thinks to himself, now I've done it. I've got some time to read the newspaper alone. That's going to take her a while. But a few minutes later, the daughter returns and waves in front of him the pasted back together world. He looks at her and thinks she must have just done it without thinking about the geography and the borders. How did she do it so fast? And she says to him, "It wasn't hard. On the other side of the picture of the world was the picture of a person. I know what a person looks like. I put the person together, and the whole world fell into place. Tell your stories. Listen to stories that challenge what you have been told. Seek out storytellers who are different than you. Surprise people with your accent or lack of. Surprise them with your Mariah Carey tape. Surprise them by climbing out of the clamshell. With our stories, we put together the world that has been torn apart. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.